Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of various aspects of Japanese culture, and today I want to talk about a new TV show called Hotspot, which brings together a few unlikely interests and experiences of mine into a single entity.
富士山のふもとビジネスホテルに勤める遠藤清美。
じゃあお先です。
お疲れ様でした。高橋さんって仕事終わった後ちょっとだけ残りますよね。ちょっと嫌じゃないですか。わかる。
そんな清美はある日。
大丈夫ですか？
高橋さん。先日はありがとうございました。
誰にも言わないでね。実は俺宇宙人なのね。内緒にしてもらいたいんだよね。
はあ、わかりました。
ちょっと待って。
はい。
俺今なんかやばいこと言い出したと思ってすぐに切り上げたよね。
いえ。
本当に宇宙人なのよ。
やばい人じゃないですか？
やっぱり宇宙人とかじゃなくて
やばい地球人。
ひょっとしてだけどもう言っちゃってない？
いや、言ってないです。
ね、絶対言ってるでしょ。
高橋さんって宇宙人だって聞いたんですけど。口硬いんで。
I really like this show because it's very unconventional. It has an outlandish premise, but is fundamentally small and quiet and ordinary in ways that are funny and touching.
高橋さんの力でなんとかお願いできませんか
It stars Mikako Ichikawa, Akihiro Kakuta, and Suzuki Kaho, Rinko Kikuchi, Kami Hiraiwa, and a bunch of other people, including Fumio Kohinata, who you might know from MIU 404. Mikako Ichikawa, who's the lead, you would know from Dr. Storks. The premise of the show, simply put, is that it's set in a little town in Yamanashi at the foot of Mount Fuji. If you know that area, Mount Fuji straddles Yamanashi and Shizuoka. Shizuoka is the coastal side. Yamanashi is the landlocked side. It's one of the only landlocked prefectures in Japan. So the story is set in a fictional town called Fuji Asada, set at the foot of Mount Fuji, close to one of the 5 lakes. It was actually shot in Fuji-Oshira and Kawaguchiko. Close to where I used to live in Kofu, I used to visit that area. And it's a beautiful part of Japan. It's very rural. It's kind of surprising because it's comparatively close to Tokyo. It's only a couple of hours and it's very, very different. Chotto inaka. Demo. So there are spectacular views of Mount Fuji, and Fuji has always been associated with strange things as well. So the main character is Kiyomi Endo, played by Mikako Ichikawa, who works in a little onsen hotel at the foot of Mount Fuji. One of the guys who works at the hotel with her is a guy called Takahashi, who is this sort of unassuming, ordinary, quiet guy. And then one day, as she is cycling home, she has a minor accident which nearly turns into a fatal accident, and he rescues her by using clearly supernatural powers. It turns out that he is, as he says, an alien.
副作用大丈夫ですか？
いや、うちのホテルの温泉って体を治す効力があるんだよ。2日に1回ぐらいは使んなきゃだから。
そういえば今日オーナーが来るんだって。支配人います？
え？
うちのホテルがなくなるらしいんですよ。
例の件はどうなりました？
ホテルがなくなったら高橋さん死んじゃうかも。
実は僕未来人なのね。
言ってなかったでしたっけ？水君超能力者なんですよ。
やばくない？でも不正さえ暴けば計画自体阻止できるかもしれない。
あとは俺が事務所に忍び込んで合意書を見つければいいってことか。
It's a 10-episode season. When I tell you that premise, you might have all kinds of expectations as to what the kind of show is, sort of big and dramatic and full of suspense and supernatural stuff. And it's kind of not any of those things. It's quiet and funny and ordinary. even though the story sort of expands and starts to reveal other sort of strangenesses associated with this particular area. And that's part of the joke, right? The stranger things get, the smaller and more mundane they also get. And what drives the show more than anything else is the character work, because it feels completely realistic. This is a very small community driven by people who have known each other since they were children, and they're constantly talking about, telling stories about when they were in middle school together and things like that. When Takahashi and some of the other people get involved in having to do supernatural things, they are mostly doing... They're mostly trying to fix like the smallest, most minor problems that these people have in their ordinary lives. And many of the problems are kind of driven by a kind of social embarrassment and awkwardness, trying to cover up or fix little problems. As the story progresses, it does escalate. Some of it is about maintaining the secrecy of the people with their sort of special abilities, but it's also about the future of the town in ways that becomes clear in the course of the series. Now, let's just back up for a second, because Hotspot is an interesting choice of title. Japan was designated a UFO hotspot by the US government last year. Now, this is not to say that they think there are aliens in Japan. This means that there's a lot of anomalous aerial phenomena, which could be associated with, for example, Chinese spy drones and things like that. And so the Japanese government has addressed this more rigorously. But as I say, you know, the idea of Yamanashi and Fuji itself being a kind of hotspot for strangeness is an old idea. It goes well beyond the kind of urban myths and things surrounding UFOs and aliens and so on. And in a sense, it taps into the roots of yokai culture. One of the things about the supernatural in Japan is that the stories often evolve, and the shifting point between traditional yokai and things that we might call urban or even rural myths is pretty small. If you read a lot about yokai, you'll read about ancient stuff, kitsune and kappa and tanuki and what have you. But you'll also read about things like kuchisake onna, you know, the slit-mouthed woman who reveals her face. And these are modern. Many of these stories are like late 20th century at the earliest. So the idea of the hotspot as something that draws on strange energies and either attracts or generates strangeness in that sort of area is very common. And if you look up UFO sightings in Japan, one of the first places you're going to see is Yamanashi. Now, this is where it starts to get very personal for me, because not only, as I say, did I live in Yamanashi, I also had a UFO experience in Kofu. Fairly undramatic. I saw something strange in the sky, which I couldn't identify, which I subsequently wrote about. And I wrote about it in this. Now, if you have been paying attention to UFOs, UAPs, and all that sort of stuff, you will know that things have gone sort of crazy in the last few years and led to some pretty serious high-level discussions, congressional hearings, for example, in the US.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still on the program.
Some of this stuff grew in part out of this book. This is one of the things that I do with Tom DeLonge. I've been working with him for 10 years. And the Secret Machines Chasing Shadows book created quite a lot of ripples, some of which led to some of these current conversations and investigations. To the Stars, the company that Tom runs, was also involved in revealing some of the most iconic UFO footage shot from Navy pilots' gun camera.
Oh my gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. The whole thing, dude.
So I'm kind of embedded in this. Not only am I embedded in it, but as I say, I actually wrote about it in this book. This episode and this story is almost exactly the way I remember it. I think actually it took place in 87 rather than 89, but that's what. Otherwise, the incident in the story is exactly the way I remember it. So I feel very invested in this. But as I say, this is not a superhero story in the conventional sense. It's not a UFO story. You never see, like, you know, flying spaceships or anything like that. There is this ordinariness to the town, which is sort of spotted with the strangeness of the people who live there. And I think this is part of what makes the show so great, because a lot of the humor is kind of in spite of the supernatural elements or the paranormal, whatever you want to call it, because it's very much a sort of small, ordinary town where people are kind of fazed by strangeness and kind of not, because the strangeness is all around them. It's reminiscent of something like, I don't know if you saw Destiny, Tale of Kamakura, a movie that came out a number of years ago.
今の何？
ただのカッパだろ？
ちょっとやめてくださいよ。
ここは鎌倉だぜ。鎌倉は不思議なところでね、何千年も前から幽霊も魔物も普通の人のように仲良く暮らしてるんだよ。
And that was also premised on the idea that Kamakura was just weird. It was just strange. And there are ancient things there that are part of the natural fabric of living in this place. Around Mount Fuji is the same. It's a beautifully nuanced story. The idea that this alien guy who has these sort of superpowers, but is also vulnerable to using them. He has to replenish himself by going in the onsen, and, you know, quirky little things like if he uses his mental powers too much, he might lose his hair. And then he gets dragooned into doing these, like, incredibly minor, stupid little things to try and keep everybody's life and sense of self in balance.
いや俺のもともとある能力を引き上げるだけだからさ、ない能力は無理だよ。
そうなんだ。あ、わかった。
何？
もともとある能力ですよね。テレビの匂いってわかりますかね？
まあ基板が熱せられた匂いと、まあ埃の匂いがこう混ざったような匂いが残ってるから、まあ、わかるっちゃわかるよ。
どうです？
But as I say, it then escalates and becomes a little bit more serious in terms of securing the future of the hotel, of the town, of the natural environment, and somehow of Fuji-san itself. But I won't say too much about that because then we get into spoiler territory. One of the things I really love about this kind of show is its quietness, its smallness, right? I've talked about comparable shows in the UK like Detectorists, which is a show about friendship and people sort of pursuing hobbies and being interested in history and stuff. And it's not the kind of show that generally gets made in the US. We want more sort of big drama and high tensions and high stakes. Hotspot, like Detectorists, like Midnight Diner, like some of these other shows that I've talked about on this channel, is not that. It's a show ultimately about friendship and connections to people and the sort of mixed nature of ordinary humanity. The people who are basically decent people but have their own little selfishnesses, their own little petulances, their own little weirdnesses. but are ordinary people. And this is a very small town. The stakes, as I say, the stakes are very low. So that when a news crew comes to town and wants to talk to them about news in their life, dramatic events in their life, they find themselves talking about things like how quick one of the checkout women is in the local supermarket, and everybody thinks she's really impressive, and they all join her line because she's faster than everybody. I mean, this is how small this stuff is, right? And that's kind of the point, right? Because we frequently go to TV to see things that are bigger and more dramatic than our own lives. And when you have a show, the premise of which is about aliens, you expect it to be that. And it's absolutely not. You take all that, but then you have these really ordinary little relationships. And there's something about the way the show sets up, containing the story, not allowing the secret elements to escape. And it becomes a kind of running joke as more and more people find out. But there's a point near the end, and again, I don't want to give too much away, about containing it within the town, because the town is its own unit. And it's a private place, a secret place. And tourists come in and go, but for the people who live there, this is their place. And they deal with the various strangenesses of living there on their own terms. And there's something kind of beautiful about that. That's the sense that in ordinary life, there are miracles, you know. No. There are remarkable things that we just get used to, that we process, you know. And as you progress through the show, you start to realize that the distinction between the remarkable and the paranormal and the familiar and ordinary is kind of a matter of familiarity. When you get used to the idea that your neighbor is an alien, then you just sort of move on with that. And you process it in the same ways of all the other little ordinary things in your life. And there's something kind of wonderful about that. It serves as a sort of reminder to find specialness in your ordinary life, that you don't have to be living in this big sort of dramatic way. The character work in the show, as I said, is really terrific. You know, that there are entire episodes almost that consist mostly of the main character and her middle school friends sitting around talking about kind of almost nothing, in that special way that friends have, where it becomes a very contained conversation. They're constantly referencing things amongst themselves, and long takes, you know, where it's just people talking, and we're not constantly trying to push the story forward or escalate the tension or anything like that. It isn't that. And I kind of love that, and it's part of why I say it's reminiscent of things like Midnight Diner. I find shows like this particularly appealing at the moment because the world is in such a mess, and there's something reassuring about the quietness of a show like this, and being able to kind of literally close the rest of the world out and go to this little place. And apparently this has generated a lot of tourism to Fuji Yoshida and Kawaguchiko. The Fuji Yoshida town website now has a special section for tourists modeled entirely on all the real venues in the show, which are actual functioning cafes and such with the same names, where people can go and feel like they're part of the show. And I find that really interesting. I think the appeal of it, the idea of wanting to sort of shut the city out, to escape from a lot of what's going on in the world and go and immerse yourself in this sort of landscape, which is simultaneously very small and ordinary and undramatic, but it takes place in the extraordinary shadow of Mount Fuji, which gives everything a sense of grandeur and strangeness and symmetry. It's remarkable, you know? And very beautiful, and of course I recommend it. And I always recommend people going to Yamanashi because it's very much off the beaten track in terms of tourism, but it's one of my favorite places in the world. So anyway, so the show's on Netflix. The subtitles are really good, and it's a great way to, you know, work on your Japanese. And I recommend it. It's very quiet and very small. It may be too small, too quiet for your taste, but I really like it. And it's one of those shows that recharges your batteries a little bit. All right, that's it. That's all I'm going to say. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my books, including the Secret Machines books. But also, of course, if you like the Japanese stuff, Hideki Smith. I will have news about Hideki Smith very soon. Check out my Patreon page. The link to my Patreon page is in the description for this video. This channel is not monetized, so a special thank you to my patrons who make its very existence possible. Check out my little Dashery store. Again, the link is in the description for the video. And that's it. I will talk to you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.